Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of To Handle the Hot. आज हमारे साथ मौजूद है मिस माहीन अहमद जो कि नस्ट की सबसे अच्छी फैकल्टी हैं and she has been with IPRI for 3 to 4 years and afterwards she is been with Nust for like 2 years and she has done her public management and public policy from Erasmus University. Assalamu alaikum ma'am. क्या हाल है आपके?
वालेकुम अस्सलाम रमीना, थैंक यू। पहले से मैं डिस्क्लेमर दे दूं कि ये मैंने पे नहीं किया रमीना को कि ये मेरा इतना अच्छा इंट्रोडक्शन मेरा दे।
मिस माहीन अपने बैकग्राउंड के बारे में बताइए. How did you get into teaching at Nust?
अच्छा, बैकग्राउंड तो आपने इतना अच्छा बता भी दिया है, बट आई विल टेल यू कि मैं हाउ डिड आई गेट इनटू टीचिंग। आई थिंक ये थोड़ा सा क्लीशे साउंड करेगा, बट आई थिंक एट सम लेवल आई ऑलवेज वांटेड टू बी अ टीचर। जब मैं छोटी थी तो आई यूज्ड टू ऑलवेज हैव दी स्टफ्ड एनिमल्स मेरे सामने, और वहाँ पे मैं उनको पढ़ाती थी विद अपना चॉक बोर्ड और जो भी कुछ होता था। एंड आई थिंक आई हैड द प्रिविलेज ऑफ हैविंग सच अमेजिंग टीचर्स ग्रोइंग अप कि I can shamelessly say कि वो उनके नाम मेरे passwords होते थे email accounts के, so I used to really be fascinated and I had a huge respect for the job of teaching. But when I was in my own career, exploring my own career path, so I always wanted to a little bit कि मैं थोड़ी सी teaching side पे आ जाऊँ. So I started visiting faculty, as you know, and थोड़ा सा मैंने नस्ट के साथ मैंने time गुजारा, and I think the real push came from my students because I really enjoyed teaching them. I enjoyed learning from them. I realized that this is where my passion lies. And I remember on my last day, I had asked everyone to sort of give me feedback on the course itself, okay, what should be improved in the years to come. And they all handed me these little folded chits of papers. और I'll never forget कि मैंने उस वक्त तो मैंने अपने बैग में डाल दिए थे completely. But then जब मैंने बाद में I think I was sitting in someone's room and I started opening them one by one, and उसमें they had little notes saying please don't leave, everything was great, please don't continue teaching. That moved me so much to finally take the plunge into teaching. So I owe to them.
आप नस्ट में कौन से courses पढ़ाती हैं and what's your teaching philosophy?
So my background is in public administration and public policy. So I choose subjects that have something to do with public management, so like public ad. And I also choose subjects that have something to do with public policy, so human security, domestic issues of that nature.
What's your teaching philosophy?
Philosophy. I think in Nust का सबसे अच्छी ये चीज़ है कि we get students from all sorts of backgrounds, be it economic backgrounds, be it from different diverse backgrounds, different ways of life. Everyone has a different learning style. And that can be in a challenge itself because you want to make sure that every student is learning. You want to know that everyone is on the same page. You don't want to go too fast or too slow. And I think that itself is my philosophy. I want to make sure that there's no child in that class who feels that this class isn't for me, and that they generally enjoy that learning experience. So what I try to do is cater my lessons plans as such. It takes a little bit more time and effort, but I think that really pays off eventually. Like simple like thank you at the end of the day, at the end of the class, it goes such a long way. Because you have to understand kids, some have, they learn visually, some learn through discussions, some prefer reading, some like slides, some don't like slides. So इस तरह से you have to cater to all sorts of learning styles.
Okay, so as a teacher आपके लिए सबसे बड़ा challenge क्या रहा है and how do you try to overcome them?
Okay, I think I just answered that. I think the challenge itself has been trying to keep everyone on the same page. And yay, I think the overcome is how I basically try to, put a little bit more time and effort in planning the lecture so that students understand that, I want them to enjoy learning as much as possible. That's essentially what I strive for, and that I think is a challenge as well, because I don't know, someone had told me the other day that Generation Z ke attention span is about 7 seconds, so it's always a challenge to make sure that 7 seconds may I keep everyone interested. But it's not just falling in love with the subject, but it's also falling in love with learning. I think that's the challenge of making sure students really enjoy learning experience.
So, given that your background is public management and public policy, so why did you choose to study policy?
Why did I choose policy? Interesting, because I feel like when I began, actually my background, my bachelor's was not in public policy. It was in management, but I used to work in the private sector. तो उसके बाद, maybe perhaps it was because of the role models in my life that I kind of saw firsthand how public service can make an impact in people. And so I really was fascinated by, कि नहीं, मैं भी बड़ी होकर I'm going to make an impact myself. And so I transitioned to the public sector. And that's where I began understanding, well, okay, policy itself is what dictates and moves the public sector to where you want it to, right? So it's the job of those in power, right, and all of the systems and institutions in place in the public sector to make sure that they govern a society where people, are dignified. And I think that's essentially that impact is what kind of changed me, brought me to wanting to study policy.
आपके ओपिनियन में आजकल पॉलिसी मेकर्स को कौन-कौन से बड़े चैलेंजेस फेस करने पड़ते हैं?
Ooh. Um, for that, I think you have to understand how policy is kind of created. So, we've studied this in class as well, but there's a model, a Kington model. And essentially, there are three streams for the policy to be formed, right? You have a problem stream, you have a politics stream, and you have a policy stream, right? And what ends up happening is that a window of opportunity is created when all three of those streams come together. And so, for example, what does it mean to have a problem stream? It means that you know that their problem actually exists. For example, a country that has no issue of poverty, right, should not be following policies that are catered towards poverty, right? Or politics, it means that all the political stakeholders involved, right, understand and identify कि ये problem है, मौजूद है हमारे मुल्क में. And policies is having everyone who is a stakeholder have a solution at that point. So I think the biggest problem in world over and also in our country is that sometimes we don't focus on the policies that we should be focusing on because they don't attract the most attention, right? It's the window of opportunity isn't created at that point. So, for example, food insecurity is a huge policy area that we should be focusing in Pakistan and world over as well, considering agriculture takes about 60% of your land area, right? More than your urban, 40% actually, or more than your urban sprawl altogether, right? So you should be considering food insecurity, but we don't because it doesn't make the headlines. It's not the trendy thing, especially in Pakistan, जहाँ पे आपको isolated terrorist incidents होते हैं when you have a security problem. So our focus moves towards there. In Pakistan, we also have an issue with political instability. So our focus moves towards that, the politics aspect. And policy areas like food insecurity, which I think are more demanding of our time, attention, resources, they go under the surface. So I think for your question, the question is, well, which policies, which areas should we be focusing on? I think हमें वो focus करनी चाहिए that problem stream by first identifying कि हमारे problem क्या है? What are the policies that are needed at this time and in this hour? Not necessarily the big catchy things that we hear about.
Okay. So आजकल environmental issues are like the global problem at this level, and अभी हम लोगों ने recently news भी सुनी है कि they have given the final warning as well कि it's now or never. तो इसके बारे में आप क्या कहेंगे?
I think it's interesting that this is such a relevant policy issue that we should be also considering. What I say is interesting is because when I discuss environmental issues हमारे classes में, तो I had this one student who told me कि ma'am, it's a privilege to talk about environment. It's a privilege to talk about climate change. And I understand that sentiment because she was a little bit angry at the fact that, for example, a country like Pakistan, who has not contributed to any emissions, any global emissions, right? It suffers and is the most vulnerable to climate change, right? So why should an ordinary Pakistani who, for example, is facing multidimensional poverty in one aspect of their lives, be concerned about temperatures rising. But that's, I think, where the problem is. I told her as well that, climate change is a threat multiplier. So what it does, it is magnifies existing vulnerabilities in your country, right? So even if you think that you did not contribute, ultimately you are vulnerable to it. So you have to accept that. And you have to understand that there are other weaknesses in your country, right? That can be magnified by the impact of climate change. अभी मैंने food security की बात की है. Food insecurity in Pakistan, even before the floods hit, there were 38 million people who was moderately or severely food insecure in the country. So you have to understand that जो आपके existing problems are now, climate change is just magnifying them. Because what happened with global warming? Because global warming hit, you have droughts and floods that have destroyed your livestock. It has destroyed homes, led to mass displacement. Isme, your key policies should be oriented towards your urban planning. They should be oriented towards your agriculture system. How to build a more resilient Pakistan to have to cope up with the effects of climate change.
Okay. सो आपका एक्सपीरियंस एंड एक्सपर्टीज़ इन पॉलिसी मेकिंग, आप ऐसी कौन सी पॉलिसीज़ जो है वो कहेंगी कि वी शुड इम्प्लीमेंट टूवर्ड्स द बेटरमेंट ऑफ आवर एनवायरनमेंट?
For the betterment of our environment? For that, I think the process of policymaking needs a little bit of tweaking. Ideally, Pakistan, for example, your chief executive sets the policy. Under the constitution, they set the policy. And what happens is that they're supposed to, ideally, according to the manifesto that they came elected into power, they set the priority areas, right? So maybe climate change would be one of them. Then they go to the ministry, right? And they ask them to prepare a draft proposal. और उस ministry को उस वक्त काम है कि they take their time, right? They look for the data, they look for evidence-backed solutions, and they prepare a draft. It's not over here, then, right? उसके बाद, this draft should be ideally passed around to stakeholders. Because then stakeholders, for example, अगर agriculture की बात हो रही है, again, you're going to be like, ma'am, food की क्यों बात कर रही है? But I think it's a very huge link with climate change. Their job is to essentially, like, for example, agriculture की बात है, तो you should have farmers, the voice of the farmers, inside this document. So everyone has a say, everyone has a voice. It's not just at a superficial kind of level understood, but accepted. Their policy recommendations should be ingrained into the document. And then it should be sent to the legislature where, your National Assembly, your Senate should be debating upon it. After that, it should be passed on as a bill. That is how the policy formulation is supposed to happen. But there's a little bit of weaknesses in this entire process. Number one, it's a very, what ends up happening is that it's a very top-down approach. It's not a bottom-up approach. So the ideas where we're supposed to get stakeholders are not incorporated, right? At a superficial level, yes, maybe, that you hear their voice and things of that sort, but this is where academia really comes in handy. It's where research really comes in handy. Okay, find solutions that are data-driven. Find solutions that actually are identifying the correct problem. It's not a guiding document. It's supposed to be very clear. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that ambiguities बहुत ज़्यादा होती हैं हमारे documents में, कि we don't know which actor is responsible for what, right? Of course, this problem has become even more so after the 18th Amendment, because you have issues के federal jurisdiction में क्या है, provincial jurisdiction क्या है. But more than that, there's no implementation mechanism. There's no monitoring mechanism. There's no accountability mechanism in all of these policy documents. And then at the end of the day, there's also no policy continuity. तो ऐसी बात नहीं है कि हमारे पास environment, climate change policy नहीं है, food policy नहीं है. We have all of that. But how much of that is being implemented? How much of that do the actors themselves know what is required of them to do? And how much of that is actually the real solutions? So I think a long answer to your short question, I think the issue lies in the process itself of policies. I think our policies can become much better if we start taking in the voice and consideration of different stakeholders. So, for example, farmers should be opened up to better technologies, better markets, better practices. So that they understand what contribution, for example, agriculture has on climate change and vice versa. How can climate change affect their lifestyle?
Okay, so do you think कि जो हमारी जो policies बनती हैं in Pakistan, they are influenced or maybe somewhat motivated by the European policies? क्योंकि हमारा जो section है वो is way too different from the European one. So हमें ज़्यादा focus इस side पे करना चाहिए. तो कुछ इस तरीके से होता है कि हमारी motivated हो उनसे.
I think at some level, because you have to understand that there's not a one solution for everything, right? So, but I think this awareness that we need indigenous solutions is starting to catch on. But it's something for example, your generation to take forward, to come up with indigenous solutions. And that's a lot of critique that we have with not just our policies, but everything, whether or not we should go to the IMF. Is the IMF, for example, a solution for us? Right? Because people say, well, it shouldn't be. And there's an awareness that is eventually happening. For example, like poverty ka concept tha. Poverty used to be कि you don't have a certain amount of wealth, right? Would be classified as someone being poor. But now it's multidimensional poverty has come up, which means that it's aside from being economically poor, there's other ways a person, individual can be poor. Maybe they don't have access to shelter or education or access to healthcare, right? So they consider this in multidimensional poverty. And the best thing about multidimensional poverty is understanding that, for example, a person, a poor in your country, in South Asia, may not necessarily be deprived of the same things as a poor person in Africa, for example, or a poor person in the Americas, right? It's very different. And I think that's the first step for better policy formation, to understand your population, understand what are their needs, what are their problems, what are their deprivations, what can actually improve their livelihood is indigenous solutions.
कि पब्लिक अवेयरनेस का कितना रोल होता है इन द इम्प्लीमेंटेशन ऑफ अ पॉलिसी?
Ooh, I think a very big one, because it goes back to that stream that I told you about. कि वो जो आपके identifying the problem, right? So उस वक्त आप as citizens, we have to understand that we ourselves can move the agenda, right? So if you continuously, for example, if you were prime minister and you have a huge lobby of citizens more concerned about climate change, it's very likely that, you as prime minister would say, okay, maybe I need to focus my priority towards that, right? So, consider it comes down to our policies being more climate adaptable, right? Rather than just mitigating the effects of climate, you have to consider how to adapt to the climate change. So imagine, Ajab, when did you come to, how did you come to school, university?
Car.
By car, right? How long does it take you to come to car?
15 minutes.
Oh, wow, okay. That surprises me. 15 minutes is actually a really good time. It takes me about an hour, right? An hour and more, right? I'm like, I don't live that far. It should ideally take me 30 minutes, but it takes me an hour. Because what's ended up happening is all these roads are becoming jam-packed with extra cars on the roads. My population bhi बढ़ रही है, so there's a lot of people on the roads. And there's construction problems, and it's very poor urban planning. Now, how does this fit into the problem of climate change? Because what we're doing is that we're not building climate smart cities. We're not building sustainable cities, right? You can see it. We don't encourage or incentivize someone to walk, right? You can't walk to university. I can't use a public transport to university. What I do is I have to sit in a car and I have to come to a university, right? And it's taking me a lot of time because we're not incentivizing friendly practices, right? You're not what we do is we enlarge the road to cope up with more cars, but that's only going to be a short-term solution. Envision a Pakistan where you have access to sidewalks, you have access to walking, you have access to public transport, right? And you can actually freely and use it without any sort of fear, without any sort of issue, right? That is taking steps towards a more sustainable Pakistan, right? You're building a more resilient Pakistan, right? So I think in this case, in your everyday lives, you can identify different places where your voice will matter and how climate environment friendly practices will matter.
So, what changes would you suggest to the government for making policy more effective?
Ooh. I think I would like to begin with data. I'd say that, back up, take the time and back up every solution with the right data. And that data has to be indigenous. It means it has to be not some other institutional coming and telling you कि फलाना आपके ये poverty issue है या आपकी ये climate का issue है. You have to come up with the numbers yourself, right? Take some time, find the numbers, find the issues that matter, and kind of back up every solution with evidence. So I think that would be my key recommendation. Another recommendation would also involve the right stakeholders into the policy chart, the pie.
What recent or upcoming changes do you predict that will affect the policies?
Uh, I think what would affect the policy, I think our issue is policy continuity. We don't have one particular policy that stays, continuous policies. And I think that in the years to come will be changing the way that we sort of, whether we like it or not, because of our political instability, our policies will not continue. And I think that's one change, will negatively impact policies. But positively, I think the use of technology, it's not my domain, but I think the use of technology is growing. And I think we can think of much better solutions and practices. The other day I was reading about this in food insecurity, I was reading about how climate smart agriculture practices, right, aided with the help of technology, is catching on. So I think that itself, not being resistant to such technologies, can help in policy making to come.
Okay, for someone who is interested in the field of policy making or in general wants to work in the governance, तो आप उनको क्या advice देंगे?
I think one should be open. I think we should be open to a particular issue. I think we shouldn't close our doors and opportunities. Like, for example, when I started off, I used to be very big on water security. I used to only think about water, and policies related to water. And I used to, stop thinking of other elements in problems that our country may be facing. So, but what that does is that you stop reading, right? You stop reading about what problems. You stop speaking to people who have another issue. So I think one should be open when they enter some particular field like this. Understand that there's so much to learn in this. There's so much to learn, and one should continue researching on the different sort of problems that should be addressed and to make a more equitable world.
So for someone who is a starter, तो आप उसको research के लिए किस तरह से बोलेंगे? So like for example, if someone wants to go in towards policy making, so if they have to do like policy briefs or in general just listen to things, or maybe how would you suggest कि वो start अपना लें?
Well, first of all, read, right? Read what people have already said. And then going back to the data wala bit, right? Try to find evidence yourself to see that this problem exists. What I see is that we tend to do sweeping statements a lot. Okay, our country, it's plagued by poverty. How many people are actually poverty? Below the poverty line, and what constitutes a poverty? Oh yeah, we need to eliminate child labor in our country. Well, why? Really dig into why. Not just because someone said so, or why is it a problem? Kind of really dig into why this is an issue. Increasingly, the youth has become radicalized. Well, what does radicalized mean? Who decides what's the metric of radicalization, and how much of the youth? And who says who says they're becoming radicalized? You have to go out and find the solution. You have not only the solution, you have to find out the problem. Identifying the correct problem, I think, is key for anyone to enter the policy making sphere.
So now as we are ending the podcast, so it's a rapid fire questions करेंगे हम.
Ooh, fun.
Yes. Okay, so mountain or beach?
Beach.
Teaching or office work?
Oh, for sure, teaching.
Books or movies?
I'd like to say books, but I think I watch more movies than I read books. I will shamelessly mention that.
Money or happiness?
Money or happiness? For sure, money. I mean, happiness.
Okay, first वाला true
Happiness.
होता है.
Happiness.
Travel to the past or travel to the future?
Ooh, I think the future.
Okay, Ipri or Nust?
Nust.
Tote bag or paper bags?
Tote bag.
Chai or coffee?
Chai and also Coke. I don't know, it's not in the categories, but Coke.
Vegan or carn?
What's carnivore?
Yeah, I guess. Meat.
Can I be like an omnivore? Like I like my veggies and my meat both.
I guess carn is meat जो
Just
खाते
meat?
हैं. नहीं, I mean like both. They are not just pure vegan.
Okay, then yes, then okay, carnivore. But
Okay, solar energy or wind energy?
interesting. Solar.
Okay. Morning person or evening person?
Morning.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs for sure.
Introvert or extrovert?
Extrovert?
Thrifty or unthrifty?
I'd like to say thrifty.
Thinker or a doer?
Ooh, I think I'm a thinker. Or maybe I'm a doer. No, I think I'm a thinker.
Okay, and with that, thank you so much for coming
Thank you
towards the
for having
podcast.
me. Thank you, Khadafis.